The key didn't turn. I stood on my own porch, with dirt still on my knees, from kneeling at Margaret's grave, and my key would not turn. I tried it again, slower this time, thinking my hands were just tired. The brass slid in the way it had slid in for 31 years. But the cylinder was wrong. The pins were wrong. Somebody had changed my locks while I was standing over my wife's headstone, telling her I still didn't know how to sleep in an empty bed. Then the porch light came on, though it was 2 in the afternoon, and the door opened 4 inches on a chain I had never installed. My son Marcus looked out at me through the gap. Behind him, I could hear his wife's voice, low and satisfied, saying something I couldn't make out. Marcus didn't say hello. He didn't ask about the cemetery. He looked at me the way a man looks at a delivery he didn't order, and said, "Dad, you can't just show up here anymore." And that was the exact moment I understood that my son believed he had already won. Before I tell you what he said next, and what I did about it, do me one small favor. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from right now. I read every single one of them. And if stories about quiet people finding their spine are your kind of story, tap that like button and subscribe, because you are going to want to see how this one ends. To understand how I ended up locked out of the house I built, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. My name is Nathaniel Reyes. I am 71 years old, and for 44 of those years, I was a locksmith. Not the kind who sits in a mall kiosk copying keys for luggage. I built and installed high security systems, bank vaults, evidence rooms, gun safes, the master key hierarchies for 2 hospitals and half the office towers downtown. When a courthouse needed a lock nobody could pick, they called Reyes Security. When a jeweler got robbed, the insurance adjuster wanted my name on the report. I spent my whole life making certain that the wrong people stayed on the wrong side of a door. There is a particular irony in that, and believe me, I have tasted every drop of it. I married Margaret when I was 24, and she was 22, and I loved her with a completeness that embarrasses me to describe. She was a second-grade teacher for 30 years. She could quiet a room of screaming children with one raised eyebrow, and she could quiet me the same way. We built the house on Cypress Lane together, board by board, over 3 summers in the early 90s. I wired every outlet. She painted every wall twice, because she never liked the first color. We raised our son Marcus in that house, and we buried a lot of dreams there too, the ones about the second child that never came. That house was not an asset. That house was our entire marriage standing up in wood and glass. Margaret got sick in the autumn 2 years ago. It was pancreatic, and it was fast, and it was cruel, in the specific way that disease is cruel to gentle people. I nursed her at home for 11 months. I learned to run a feeding line. I learned to lift her without hurting her hips. I learned that a man my age can go on 4 hours of sleep for the better part of a year, if the reason is good enough. And near the end, when she could still talk, she held my hand and said, "Nathaniel, promise me you won't let this make you hard." I promised. I meant it. I am still trying to keep that promise. And this story is partly about how close I came to breaking it. She died in April. And that is where my son enters the story properly. So let me tell you about Marcus. Marcus was 43. He was our only child. And I will not pretend I didn't spoil him, because Margaret and I both did. He was clever without being wise, which is the most dangerous combination a person can carry into middle age. He'd bounced through 3 careers by the time he was 40. Always certain the next one would be the one that made him rich. Always certain the failure of the last one was somebody else's fault. 2 years before Margaret died, he married a woman named Vanessa. And Vanessa is the reason I no longer trust my first impressions of anyone. She was polished. That is the word I kept reaching for. Every hair in place, every sentence rehearsed, Every compliment aimed at exactly the soft spot it was designed to hit. She called me Dad within a month of meeting me. And something in my chest tightened every time she did, though I told myself I was just a grumpy old man who didn't like change. Margaret never warmed to her. Margaret, who could soothe a screaming 7-year-old, went quiet and careful around Vanessa, the way you go quiet around a wasp that has landed on your arm. I should have listened to my wife. Listening to my wife was the smartest thing I ever did for 47 years. And the one time I stopped, it cost me nearly everything. In the weeks right after the funeral, Marcus and Vanessa were around constantly. At the time, I was grateful for it. I thought, at least the boy is stepping up. Vanessa cooked. She organized the sympathy cards. She sat with me at the kitchen table and asked soft questions about the house, the accounts, the paperwork, and I answered them all, because grief makes you honest and stupid at the same time. She learned that the house was paid off. She learned that Margaret had a life insurance policy. She learned that I kept our savings in 3 places, and that I, being an old-fashioned man, still did a great deal of my record-keeping on paper in a fireproof box in the study. I told her everything. I handed her the map to my life, and I called it kindness. I need you to understand the house before you understand what it meant to lose it. Because to Marcus and Vanessa, it was a number on a deed, and to me, it was the only thing I had left that still had Margaret's fingerprints on it. I built the door frames a 1/4 inch too narrow for standard doors, by accident, the first summer, because I was a locksmith and not a carpenter, and I was learning as I went. Margaret never let me forget it. Every door in that house sticks a little in humid weather. And for 31 years, every summer, she'd shoulder open the bathroom door and call out, "Nathaniel, your famous doors again." And I'd call back, "They're secure, that's the point." And it became a joke so worn and so soft that we didn't even need the words anymore at the end, just the look. I carved our initials into the concrete of the back step before it set, in 1992, and I taught Marcus to ride his bike in the driveway, running behind him with my hand on the seat, and the day I let go and he didn't fall, he rode straight into the garbage cans and got up laughing, with a scraped elbow and no fear at all. That was my boy at 7, fearless and laughing. I keep trying to find that boy and the man who packed my life into a fishing bag, and the finding of him, at the very end, is the only reason this story doesn't break my heart clean in two. I taught Marcus about locks in that garage. It was the one thing I knew that he found interesting as a child. The mechanical magic of it, the way a few pins and springs could hold or release the whole weight of a door. I bought him a clear practice padlock, the kind apprentices use, where you can see the mechanism through the plastic, and I taught him to feel the pins set one by one under a pick. He was good at it, better than I expected, and I remember thinking, God help me. I remember thinking, this boy has good hands, maybe he'll come into the business someday. He never did. But I think about those afternoons more than almost anything, because I taught my son that every lock can be opened by a patient person who understands it, and I never once imagined he'd grow up to test that lesson against me. Margaret and I had, by any honest measure, a good life in that house. Not a rich one. A locksmith and a schoolteacher do not get rich, and we didn't try to. We paid the house off in 22 years by driving old cars and taking cheap vacations, and the day I made the final payment, I brought home a bottle of sparkling wine we couldn't really afford, and we drank it on the back step over our carved initials, and Margaret cried, and I pretended I didn't. That paid-off house was the trophy of a whole working life. It was the proof that 2 ordinary people had built something solid and kept it, and that, I understand now, is exactly what made us a target. Predators, like the Corbins, don't hunt the rich. The rich have lawyers and accountants and suspicion built in. They hunt people like Margaret and me. Modest, trusting, paid off, and grieving. People whose whole security is tied up in one house and one family, so that if you can turn the family, you get the house and everything else in one clean pull. I say all this so you understand that when I stood on that porch, it was not a piece of real estate they'd locked me out of. It was 31 years. It was the sticking doors, and the carved initials, and the driveway, where I let go of the bike seat. It was the last place on earth that still smelled, faintly, under the stranger's perfume, of my wife's lavender. You do not gather evidence for a year, patient and cold, over a piece of real estate. You do it for that. The first thing that felt wrong was small. It was a Tuesday in May, about 6 weeks after we buried Margaret. I went to the fireproof box to find the title to the house, because a man from the county had called about a tax reassessment, and I wanted the paperwork in front of me. The box was where it always was, but the title wasn't. Neither was the life insurance policy, nor the folder where Margaret kept her own private papers, the ones she'd asked me never to throw away. I stood in the study for a long moment and told myself I'd misfiled them. I was 71 and grieving. Old men misplace things. That is the story I told myself, and I wanted so badly to believe it that I almost did. Then Marcus called that same evening, and he was using a voice I recognized. It was the voice he used at 9 years old, when he'd already broken the thing, and was preparing to tell me it broke itself. "Dad," he said, warm and careful. "Vanessa and I have been talking. We're worried about you rattling around in that big house all alone. We think it might be time to think about your options." Options? He said the word the way a dentist says this might pinch. I told him I appreciated the concern and that I was fine. He said, "Just think about it, okay? We love you." And he hung up before I could answer, which was not like him, because the Marcus I raised always needed the last word. I didn't sleep that night, not because I understood yet. I didn't understand anything yet. I just felt the way you feel when you're standing in a familiar room in the dark, and something is out of place, and your body knows it before your eyes do. A locksmith develops that sense over 40 years. You learn to feel when a tumbler is off by a hair. My whole life was suddenly off by a hair, and I lay awake trying to name it. The naming came the following week, and it came all at once. I had a doctor's appointment on a Thursday morning, a routine thing, my heart, nothing dramatic. Afterward, on an impulse I'm still grateful for, I drove out to Greenlawn Cemetery to sit with Margaret. It was a beautiful morning, the kind she loved. I stayed 2 hours. I told her about the missing papers because I told her about everything, still, out loud, on the grass. And then I drove home to Cypress Lane, and my key would not turn in my own front door. Which brings us back to the porch, and to Marcus, looking at me through a 4-inch gap, over a chain I never installed, telling me I couldn't just show up here anymore. "This is my house," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I built this house." Marcus glanced back over his shoulder, and I heard Vanessa murmur something. And he turned back to me, and his face had rearranged itself into something rehearsed. "Dad, it's not your house. Not legally. You gave it to us. Remember? Back in the spring. You signed it over so it wouldn't get tied up if you had to go into care. We've got the deed. It's all done." He said done again, like the first time on the phone, and I finally understood that the word was a door being closed. "I never signed anything," I said. "You did, Dad." His voice dropped into a register of sorrow, so false it made my stomach turn. "You don't remember. That's kind of the whole point. The doctors are worried. We're worried. You're not tracking things the way you used to. And there it was. Not just theft. A story. A story in which I was a confused old man giving away his house and forgetting he'd done it. A story with witnesses, apparently, and paperwork, apparently, and a son standing in my doorway wearing my dead wife's grief like a costume. I want to tell you that I stood on that porch and roared. I want to tell you I put my shoulder through the door I built and dragged my son out onto the lawn by his collar. But Margaret's voice was in my ear. Don't let this make you hard. And underneath the grief and the shock, something older and colder and far more useful was waking up. 44 years of my working life had taught me one thing above all others. You do not force a lock you don't understand. You study it. You learn its pins, its springs, its weaknesses, and its maker. And only then, when you know it better than the man who built it, do you open it without leaving a mark. So I did not roar. I let my shoulders drop. I let my eyes go watery and vague, which was not hard, because they were watery already. I said, in a small and shaking voice, I'm confused. I think I'm confused. And I watched something ugly and delighted flicker across Vanessa's face, where she stood behind my son, in the shadow of my own hallway. It's okay, Dad, she said, stepping forward at last, all warmth and poison. We're going to take care of everything. There's a lovely place we found, Maple Grove. You'll have people your own age. You won't have to worry about anything anymore. She smiled at me, the way you smile at a dog you're about to put in the car for the last time. We packed you a bag. It's on the porch. There was a bag on the porch, a single canvas duffel, the one I used to take fishing. They had packed my life into a fishing bag and set it outside my own door. I picked it up. My hands were shaking, and I let them shake, and I let the two of them see me shake. Can I say goodbye to the house? I asked. Better not, Dad, Marcus said. Clean break is easier. We'll bring you your things. And he closed the door. I heard the deadbolt turn. My deadbolt, in my door, thrown by my son to keep me out. I stood there a moment longer, and then I walked down the steps and got in my car and drove to the end of Cypress Lane, where I parked under the big oak, out of sight of the house, and sat with my hands on the wheel until they stopped trembling. And when they stopped, I want you to understand something, because it is the hinge on which this entire story turns. I did not feel broken. I felt clear. Clearer than I had felt in the 11 months since Margaret got sick, because I finally knew the shape of the thing. My son and his wife had stolen my house with a forged deed and a story about my failing mind, and they had done it while I was at my wife's grave. They thought they had locked the old man out. They had forgotten what the old man did for a living. Now, before I go on, I need you to understand exactly what these two believed they were up against, because it matters for everything that comes after. They believed I was a soft, sentimental, half-senile widower who kept his records on paper and cried at his wife's grave. All of that was true, but it was not the whole truth. And the whole truth is a dangerous thing to leave out of your calculations. I drove to a motel on the county road, the Cypress Rest, $49 a night, and I paid cash for a week. I sat on the edge of a bed that smelled of bleach and cigarettes, and I made a list on the motel notepad, the way I used to spec out a security job. 3 columns. What they have, what I have, what I need. What they had was possession of the house, a deed with my signature on it, and a narrative about my mental decline. What I had was worse for them than they could possibly imagine, and I wrote it down one line at a time, and with every line I felt steadier. First, I am a master locksmith. There is not a lock in that house I cannot open. including the ones I installed myself. Changing the front cylinder kept out a stranger. It did not keep out the man who designed the whole system. Second, 9 years ago I installed a security camera system in that house. I did it myself, over a weekend, after a rash of break-ins in the neighborhood. 4 cameras, front door, back door, driveway, and, because Margaret worried about her mother's antique silver, one tucked into the bookshelf in the living room, disguised as a smoke detector. Marcus knew about the outdoor cameras. He was a teenager when I put them in. But the living room camera went in years after he'd moved out, and I would have bet my life that neither he nor Vanessa knew it existed. It recorded to a small drive in the attic, and, because I'd upgraded it during the pandemic, to a cloud account under an email address that was mine and mine alone. An email address my son did not have the password to. Third, Margaret. My wife had been many things, and one of the quietest of them was careful. She did not trust Vanessa, and my Margaret, when she did not trust someone, did not sit still. I did not yet know what she had done about it. But I knew my wife, and I knew that somewhere, in some form, she had left me a way through. I looked at that list for a long time. Then I lay back on the terrible motel bed, and for the first time since the funeral, I slept the whole night through. You have to understand what I chose to do next, because everyone who hears this story wants me to have called the police that first morning. And I understand the instinct. But think about it the way I had to think about it, sitting in that motel with a forged deed on file at the county recorder's office. If I walked into a police station and said my son stole my house, what did they see? An elderly man, agitated, making a wild accusation against his grieving son, on the very day his son says he'd been placed in memory care. The paperwork said I gave them the house. A doctor, I would soon learn, had been persuaded to note concerns about my cognition. I would be the confused old man in the story, exactly as they had written me. I would hand them the last piece they needed. No, you do not kick down a door when the person on the other side is holding a gun and a story. You gather, you document, you build a case so complete, so heavy with proof, that when you finally open the door, there is nothing left for anyone to argue about. I had spent my life making locks that could not be picked. Now I was going to build one around my son and his wife, one tumbler at a time, and I was going to do it while they thought I was drooling in a chair at Maple Grove, which, I should mention, is the other thing they got wrong, because I never went to Maple Grove. Marcus had told them I was arriving that afternoon. He'd even, in his laziness, prepaid the first month, which I only learned later, and which I found darkly hilarious. My own son paying to warehouse me, and getting even that wrong. But nobody at Maple Grove had my keys, my consent, or a court order. A private facility cannot simply hold a competent adult because his son dropped off a bag. I called them from the motel, polite as a Sunday, and told them there'd been a misunderstanding and I would not be coming. The woman on the phone was confused but relieved, I think, to have one less problem. And just like that, the story my son was telling the world had a hole in it that he did not know about. He thought I was locked away. I was free. I was clear. And I was, for the first time in my life, hunting. I want to pause here and tell you about the old lion, because Margaret would want me to, and because it explains something about me that the next several weeks brought out. When Marcus was small, maybe 6, we went to the county zoo, and there was an old male lion in the big enclosure, huge and scarred and gray around the muzzle. The other animals paced and fretted. This lion did not move. He lay in the sun, with his eyes half closed, while the whole world walked past his cage. Marcus was disappointed. "He's boring, Dad," he said. "He doesn't do anything." And a keeper standing nearby laughed and said, Son, that's the most dangerous animal in this whole park. He doesn't waste a single movement. He only moves when it counts. And when he moves, it's already over. Margaret took my hand when the keeper said that. She said quietly, only to me, "That's you, Nathaniel." I laughed it off at the time. I was not a dangerous man. I fixed locks and coached Little League. But I have thought about that old lion a great deal in the last 2 years. About how the whole park mistook stillness for weakness. About how the young ones pace and roar and exhaust themselves, and the old one simply waits, because he knows something they haven't learned yet. He knows that patience is not the absence of teeth. My son looked at me on that porch and saw a boring old animal who didn't do anything anymore. He had never once wondered why I didn't move. The next morning, I began my work, and the first tumbler I set was the simplest one. I needed to know exactly what was in that house, and I needed to see my son and his wife when they thought no one was watching. So I sat down at the little motel desk with my laptop, and I logged into the cloud account for the security cameras, the one under my private email, and I held my breath. The feed was live, all 4 cameras, front door, back door, driveway, and there, in grainy color, from inside a fake smoke detector on the living room bookshelf, was my living room, my furniture, my wife's reading chair, and sitting in it, with her shoes off and her feet tucked up like she owned the world, was Vanessa. They had never found the camera. Of course they hadn't. Why would they look? They'd changed the front lock and felt safe. They had no idea that the old man they'd thrown away was sitting in a $49 motel room, watching them walk around inside his life, recording every second of it to a drive they couldn't reach. I watched for a while that first morning. Not for evidence yet, just to understand the enemy. Vanessa moved through my house like an appraiser. She picked up Margaret's things and turned them over, checking for maker's marks, setting the good pieces in one pile and the sentimental ones in another. She held up a framed photograph of Margaret and me on our wedding day, looked at it without any expression at all, and set it face down in a box marked in black marker, with a word I could just make out when she turned it toward the light. The word was donate. I closed the laptop then. Not because I was too angry to watch, because I was suddenly, perfectly calm, and I have learned to respect that calm in myself, the way you respect the quiet before real weather. Margaret's wedding photograph, face down in a donate box, 6 weeks after I buried her. All right, I thought. All right. You want to know who the old man is? I'll show you who the old man is. I spent the next 3 days building my foundation, and I did it the way I'd have spec'd out a vault, methodically, boringly, leaving nothing to chance. I want to walk you through it, because this is the part of the story the young ones always skip, and it is the part that wins. First, I needed a lawyer, and not just any lawyer. I needed one who understood elder fraud, forged instruments, and how to move quietly. I called an old client. Years back, I'd rekeyed the offices of a law firm downtown after a nasty partnership split, and I'd gotten to know a man named Frank Delgado, a stubborn, meticulous attorney about my own age who'd stayed late every night of that job, double-checking that his ex-partner couldn't get back in. Frank had retired mostly, but he still took the cases that made him angry. I called him and I told him everything, in order, the way I'm telling you. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in a voice like a door settling into a frame, "Nathaniel, do not talk to your son again. Do not go to that house. Do not sign anything, agree to anything, or so much as answer his calls without me on the line. Can you do that?" I told him I could. He said, "Then they have already lost. They just don't know it yet." I have never in my life been so glad to hear an old man sound so certain. Second, on Frank's instruction, I got myself evaluated. This was the piece that mattered most, and I almost missed it. Frank said, "They've built their whole house on one lie, that you're not competent. Knock that out, and the whole thing falls." So I made an appointment with a geriatric specialist, a real one, and I sat through 4 hours of cognitive testing, memory, reasoning, judgment, the works. I scored, in the doctor's written words, in the superior range for age, with no evidence of cognitive impairment whatsoever. Frank had me evaluated by a second independent physician a week later, for good measure. 2 doctors, on the record, saying the old confused man was neither confused nor, in any way that counted, old. The foundation was poured. Now I could build. I'll tell you, sitting through those cognitive tests was a stranger experience than I expected. The specialist, a kind and thorough woman named Dr. Anwar, had me remember lists of words, draw a clock, count backward by 7s, explain proverbs, solve little puzzles of logic and judgment, and somewhere in the second hour, working through it all, with a clear and steady mind, I felt something I had not felt since the porch. I felt certain of myself again, because my son had done a quiet, poisonous thing when he told the world I was slipping. He hadn't just tried to steal my house. He'd tried to steal my confidence in my own mind, which is the cruelest theft there is. Because once an older person starts to doubt their own thoughts, they'll hand over anything. Every misplaced key becomes evidence. Every forgotten name becomes proof. The lie feeds itself. And there, in Dr. Anwar's quiet office, answering her questions one by one and watching her write, "No impairment," I got my own mind handed back to me on paper, and I understood how close I'd come to losing it. Not to any disease, but to a story 2 thieves had told about me, until I'd half started to believe it myself. When it was done, Dr. Anwar took off her glasses and looked at me over her notes for a long moment. "Mr. Reyes," she said gently, "may I ask why a man with cognition this sharp needed 2 of us to certify it?" And I told her, in plain words, what my son and his wife had done. She was quiet, and then she said something I've held on to ever since. She said, "I see this more than you'd believe. Somebody wants something an older person has, so they start by convincing everyone, including the older person, that the mind is going. It's the oldest lockpick there is." She wrote something extra on my chart, pressed hard, underlined it. "I'm noting for the record that you are fully competent and that you presented specifically because of a suspected financial exploitation scheme. If this ever sees a courtroom, that note will matter." It did see a courtroom. It did matter. A good doctor, like a good locksmith, understands that the most important work is done before the trouble arrives, not after. Third, and this is where being a locksmith stopped being a metaphor and became a set of hands, I needed to get back into my house, legally and cleanly, to retrieve the drive from the attic and, more importantly, to find whatever Margaret had left me. Frank was against it at first, but I explained something to him that changed his mind. It was still, legally, an open question whose house it was. The deed was forged, which meant the transfer was void, which meant that in the eyes of the law, that had not yet caught up to events, I was very likely still the owner of that house, entering my own property. Frank chewed on that and then said, "Do it once. Take a witness. Take photographs. Touch nothing that isn't yours. And Nathaniel, for God's sake, don't get caught doing it like a burglar. You're not a burglar. You're a homeowner." I laughed, and it surprised me, the sound of my own laugh. "Frank," I said, "I have never in my life needed to break into anything. I have keys to doors that don't exist anymore." I knew Marcus and Vanessa's schedule, because I'd been watching it on the cameras for 3 days. They left the house every Thursday around noon, and were gone until evening. Some appointment. I didn't know what yet. I would find out. And what I found out would turn my stomach. But that came later. What mattered was the window. Thursday, noon to 6. So on a bright Thursday afternoon, exactly 1 week after my son closed my own door in my face, I drove back to Cypress Lane, with Frank Delgado in the passenger seat as my witness, and a small leather roll of tools on the back seat that I had not opened in 4 years. The new front cylinder they'd installed was a cheap thing, a builder-grade lock from a hardware store. The kind I used to tell clients was a suggestion, not a security measure. I could have opened it with a paperclip and a nail file, but I didn't even need to, because here is what my son forgot, standing on that porch feeling so clever. When I built the house, I built the locks, and when you are a locksmith, and you build the locks in your own home, you do not build one way in. You build the door your family sees, and you build the one only you know about. There is a side door, off the mudroom, that Margaret and I used for 30 years to carry in groceries. Years ago, I fitted it with a lock of my own design, a restricted keyway cylinder whose keys can only be cut on a machine I personally own, from blanks that are not sold to the public. Marcus never used that door. Nobody used that door but me and Margaret. And Marcus, in his hurry, in his certainty, had changed the front lock and the back lock, and had never once thought about the humble mudroom door his father installed before he was old enough to shave. I put my key in that lock, and it turned like it was glad to see me. The story of what I found inside my own house is the story of how I stopped being a victim and became something my son should have been far more careful about. And I promise you, it is worth the wait. But first, quickly, if you are still with me, and if any part of this is landing the way I hope it's landing, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and give this video a like so it finds the next person who needs to hear it. Alright, come inside with me. Let me show you what they missed. The house smelled wrong. That was the first thing. 31 years I'd walked into that mudroom and smelled the same things. Margaret's lavender, old wood, coffee. Now it smelled of a stranger's perfume and takeout containers. Frank stood just inside the door with a small camera, photographing everything, saying nothing, the way a good witness does. I stood still for a moment and let the wrongness of it settle into me, because I wanted to remember exactly how this felt. A man should remember why he does a hard thing. Then I got to work, and I moved fast, because I had 6 hours, and I intended to need only 2. The attic first. The drive from the camera system was exactly where I'd left it 9 years ago, in a fireproof case, screwed to a joist behind the insulation, blinking its small green light, faithfully recording everything the living room camera had seen since the day I mounted it. I did not take it. Frank stopped me. "Leave it running," he whispered. "It's recording them right now. We take it at the end, on the record, with a police officer present. If you pull it today, they'll argue you tampered with it. Let it keep working." He was right. Of course he was right. I photographed it, noted the timestamp, and left it blinking in the dark, a patient green eye, watching my son's wife appraise my dead wife's silver. Then I went looking for Margaret, because here is the thing I had been holding on to all week, the thing that had let me sleep. My wife did not trust Vanessa, and my wife, when she did not trust someone, prepared. I did not know what she'd done, but I knew her hiding places, all of them, because for 47 years, there were no secrets between us, only surprises we saved for the right moment. I checked the loose floorboard under her side of the bed. Nothing but a paperback and a pair of reading glasses I had to sit down and hold for a while. I checked the false bottom in her jewelry box, which I'd built for her one Christmas. Empty. I checked the hat box on the closet shelf. Nothing. And I began to feel the first cold trickle of doubt. the fear that I had built my whole hope on a wife who, at the end, had simply been too sick to leave me anything but her absence. And then I remembered the recipe box. Margaret kept a green tin recipe box in the kitchen, dented and beloved, stuffed with index cards in her looping handwriting. Nobody ever touched it but her. It was, to anyone else, the single most boring object in the house, a thing full of instructions for meatloaf and pie. Vanessa, appraiser of everything, would have looked at that box and seen nothing worth a dime, which is exactly, I realized, why my wife would have chosen it. I opened it with hands that had started, again, to shake, and behind the card for her mother's apple pie, folded into quarters, was a letter in Margaret's handwriting, addressed to me, my name in her hand, Nathaniel. I had to grip the counter. I will read you part of that letter, because she wrote it better than I could ever tell it, and because you should hear her voice at least once in this story. My dear Nathaniel, if you are reading this, then either I have finally convinced you to make my apple pie, in which case, good, or something has gone wrong and you have gone looking. I hope it is the pie, but I have watched that young woman our son married, and I do not trust her, and I have learned in 30 years of teaching that when a smile never reaches the eyes, you count the silverware. So I have been counting. I made copies of everything, the real deed, our accounts, the insurance, all of it, and I have put the originals somewhere safe with instructions. Go and see Frank Delgado. I already have. He has our real will, the one that leaves everything to you, and, after you, to the children of the school where I taught, because I will not have it said that Arraius went quietly. Be the old lion, my love, not the young one who roars, the old one who waits. I know you have it in you. I married it. All my love, forever, Margaret. She had gone to see Frank Delgado. My wife, dying, too weak to climb the stairs, had gone to see the same lawyer I'd blindly called a week ago, and she had left the real will in his safe, and she had never told me, because she didn't want to frighten me, and she had trusted that if the day ever came, I would find my way to him on my own. I stood in my kitchen and I wept. I am not ashamed of it. Frank came and stood next to me and put his hand on my shoulder and said, very quietly, Nathaniel, she retained me 8 months before she died. I have the original will in my vault. I couldn't tell you because she asked me not to, unless it became necessary. It has. So now I'm telling you. Your wife, he said, and his own voice caught. Your wife was the smartest client I ever had. Everything changed in that kitchen. Up to that moment, I had been a wronged old man gathering scraps. Now I had a live security feed inside the crime scene. A real will, in a lawyer's vault, directly contradicting the forged deed. 2 doctors on record, demolishing the competence lie, and a letter, in my dead wife's hand, laying out the whole scheme before it even happened. My wife had reached out of the grave and handed me the keys. We left the house exactly as we'd found it. I locked the mudroom door behind me with the key my son didn't know existed, and Frank and I drove back to town in a silence that felt, for the first time in weeks, like the good kind. At a red light, Frank said, without looking at me, "You understand that we could end this next week. File the will, file the doctor's reports, void the deed, get you back in the house. 2, 3 weeks, tops." I told him I understood. He waited. Then he said, "But you don't want to do it next week." It wasn't a question. Frank had known me a long time. No, I did not want to end it next week. And I want to explain why. Because it is not the reason you might think. It was not only about revenge, though I will not lie to you and pretend revenge wasn't in it. It was this. I had a live camera inside a room where my son and his wife believed they were completely alone and completely safe. People who feel safe say the truest things they will ever say. And I had a suspicion, growing every day I watched that feed, that the forged deed was not the whole crime, that it was, in fact, the smallest part of it. Vanessa moved through my accounts and my papers with a fluency that frightened me. This was not a woman improvising a grab at a house. This was a professional, doing a job she had done before. If I ended it next week, I'd get my house back, and my son would get a slap on the wrist, and Vanessa would vanish, and do it to some other family, some other grieving old man, with no camera in his bookshelf, and no dead wife, clever enough to leave a letter in a recipe box. I did not just want my house back. I wanted the whole thing, the whole rotten root of it, pulled up into the light where everyone could see. So I told Frank to wait, and Frank, God bless his stubborn heart, said, "All right, we wait, but we wait smart," and we did. Here is what the waiting looked like, because I don't want you to imagine it was passive. Waiting is not the same as doing nothing. The old lion in that enclosure was not doing nothing. He was watching the herd, learning which one limped. Every morning, coffee in hand, I opened the laptop and I watched my house. I learned their routines. I learned that Marcus drank in the afternoons now, and that it made him loud, and that Vanessa did not like it. I learned that they fought, low and vicious, when they thought no one could hear. And I learned, watching Vanessa on the phone one evening, pacing my living room, that there was a third person in this. A man she called Wes, to whom she spoke in a completely different voice than the one she used for my son. A voice with no polish on it at all. A flat, working voice. And to whom she said things like, "The father's handled," and "The timeline's fine." And once, chillingly, "This one's cleaner than the Hollisters." The Hollisters. I wrote the name down. I did not know who the Hollisters were. But I knew, the way I knew a bad pin from a good one, that somewhere out there was another family this had already happened to. And that changed the whole shape of what I was building. I was no longer defending myself. I was, whether I'd meant to be or not, on the trail of something. I gave Frank the name. Frank gave it to a private investigator he trusted, a quiet woman named Elena Cruz, who did the kind of patient document work that solves cases juries never understand. And Elena Cruz went looking for the Hollisters. I want to slow down here and tell you how I actually lived during those weeks, because people hear, he watched the cameras and gathered evidence, and they picture something clean and cinematic. It was not clean. It was a 71-year-old man in a cheap motel, eating gas station sandwiches, teaching himself to be a detective, one clumsy step at a time, and missing his wife so badly some nights that the grief and the anger got tangled up, and I couldn't tell which one was keeping me awake. I built a routine, because routine is what keeps an old man steady. Up at 6. Coffee from the machine in the motel lobby. Terrible coffee. The kind Margaret would have poured down the sink. Then the laptop, and the 4 camera feeds, and a spiral notebook where I logged everything with a timestamp, the way I used to log service calls. Who came? Who went? What was said? When I could read lips or hear it. 9 years of installing security systems had taught me how thieves behave when they think they're unobserved, and I watched my son's household with the cold, professional eye I'd once brought to reviewing a jeweler's break-in footage. I was not a father watching his son. I could not afford to be. I was a technician, documenting a crime scene that happened to contain everyone I had left in the world. The hardest hour of every day was dusk. That was when the motel got quiet, and the light went gold and low. And that was the hour Margaret and I used to sit on the porch of the house on Cypress Lane, not talking, just watching the neighborhood settle. I'd catch myself, some evenings, reaching for a hand that wasn't there. I'd talk to her out loud. I told her what I'd seen that day. I told her about the notebook. I asked her, more than once, whether I was doing the right thing, going slow, gathering, waiting, instead of burning the whole thing down. And though she never answered, of course she never answered, I always knew what she'd have said, because she'd already said it, in her own handwriting, folded behind a recipe for apple pie. Be the old lion, my love, the old one who waits. About 10 days into the watching, I got an ally I hadn't planned on, and I want to tell you about her, because this story is not only about the people who betray you, it's also about the ones who quietly refuse to. Her name is Ruth Kaminsky, and she has lived across the street from us on Cypress Lane for 26 years. She's a widow too, a few years older than me, sharp as a tack, and about as sentimental as a fence post, which is exactly why I trusted her. Margaret and Ruth used to trade cuttings from their gardens and complaints about their husbands. And one afternoon, running low on nerve and needing to feel like a person instead of a case file, I called Ruth from the motel. I did not tell her everything at first. I just asked how the street was. Ruth, being Ruth, cut straight to it. Nathaniel Reyes, she said, her voice dry as a cracker. Where in God's name are you? There's a strange man coming and going from your house at all hours. Your boy's wife is having your late wife's furniture carried out the front door in broad daylight, and nobody's seen hide nor hair of you in 3 weeks. I was about to call the police myself. Now you tell me right now what is going on, and don't you dare tell me you're fine, because I've known you too long to swallow it. So I told her, some of it, enough. And Ruth Kaminsky was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I'll never forget. She said, Margaret told me, 2 months before she passed. She sat right here at my kitchen table and told me she didn't trust that girl and that she'd made arrangements. And she made me promise that if anything ever looked wrong, I'd keep my eyes open. So, I've been keeping my eyes open, Nathaniel. I've got a notebook of my own. And I sat down hard on the edge of that motel bed, because my wife, my careful, quiet, dangerous wife, had built more than one lock. She'd left a letter for me, a will with a lawyer, and a watchful neighbor across the street. 3 separate safeguards, each one hidden from the others, each one waiting for the day it would be needed. She had planned her own defense from beyond the grave, and she had trusted the people she loved to find the pieces and put them together. Ruth's notebook turned out to be worth more than I could have guessed. She'd written down dates. She'd written down the strange man's car, a gray sedan, and part of a plate. She'd noted the mornings the furniture went out, and the truck that hauled it, an outfit called Quick Haul, which later, through Elena Cruz, gave us a paper trail of exactly what had been sold, and for how much, and into whose account the proceeds went. A retired schoolteacher's neighbor, with a notebook and a grudge on behalf of her dead friend, did as much damage to Wesley Corbin as any wire or warrant. Never underestimate an old woman who loved your wife. From then on, Ruth was my eyes on the ground, and I was careful with her, because I would not put her in danger, and I told her so plainly. Watch from your own window, I said. Write down what you see. Do not, under any circumstances, cross that street or speak to those people. She agreed, mostly because I think she understood, the way Margaret had understood, that the slow way was the only way that worked. Twice a week I'd call her, and she'd read me her notes in that flat, no-nonsense voice, and I'd add them to mine, and the file grew, and the lock I was building grew another pin. There was one night in those weeks I have to tell you about, because it nearly undid me, and because it's the truest thing in this whole story, about what betrayal actually feels like from the inside. It was a Sunday. Sundays were the worst, because Sunday had been our day, Margaret's and mine, church in the morning, and a long, lazy afternoon after. That Sunday I opened the feed out of habit more than purpose. And there in my living room was a thing I was not prepared for. Marcus, alone, no Vanessa, no Wesley. My son, sitting by himself in the dark in his mother's reading chair, a bottle beside him, and he was crying, not performing. There was no one there to perform for. He didn't know about the camera. He was just a man alone in a house he'd stolen, weeping in his dead mother's chair. And I sat in a motel 4 miles away and watched my son fall apart in real time and could not go to him because the man he'd become was the reason I couldn't. I nearly closed the laptop. I nearly drove over. Every father instinct I had was screaming at me to go put my hand on my boy's shoulder. And I sat on my hands, physically sat on them, and I made myself remember the porch and the fishing bag and the words confused old man, and I made myself understand something that I think is the hardest thing a parent ever has to learn. You can love someone completely and still let them face what they've earned. Rescuing Marcus from every consequence was exactly the thing Margaret and I had done his whole life, and it was exactly the thing that had made him a man who could steal from his own father. The kindest thing left to do for my son was, terribly, to let the trap close, to let him hit the bottom he was already falling toward, and to make sure that when he did, there was a way back up that led through the truth instead of around it. So I watched my son cry, and I did not go, and it was the hardest single hour of my whole life, harder even than the porch, and I have never told anyone that until right now. The next morning, I went back to work, steadier, because grief that you look straight at loses some of its power over you. That's another thing. The old lion knows that the young ones don't. You don't flinch away from the wound. You look at it until it stops being able to surprise you. While she looked, I kept up appearances, because the performance was the whole game now. Every few days I would let Marcus reach me. I'd answer the phone in a small, foggy voice. I let him believe I was drifting around a rented room, lonely and lost. Once he asked, in that oily, sorrowful tone, whether I was settling in okay at the new place, meaning Maple Grove, meaning the facility I had never set foot in, and I said, "It's hard, son. Some days I don't know where I am." I could hear the relief in his breathing. I could hear him believing it. And I hated the performance. And I understood, at the same time, that Margaret had been right about me. I did have it in me. The stillness, the patience, the willingness to lie in the sun with my eyes half closed, while the young ones paced. Because every one of those phone calls did two things. It kept them comfortable, and it dug their hole deeper. Marcus, feeling safe, got sloppy. He started saying things on those calls that a careful criminal never would. Once he said, "Dad, I need you to not talk to anybody about the house stuff, okay? It just confuses people. Confuses people." He was telling me to stay quiet, and he didn't know I was recording every second of it on a cheap app on the same laptop I used to watch him. I was building his own words into the lock I was closing around him. I got good at the performance. Too good, maybe. There's a strange thing that happens when you spend weeks pretending to be diminished, and I want to warn you about it, because it caught me off guard. You start to feel the pull of it. There is a terrible, seductive comfort in the role of the helpless old man. The world asks nothing of a person it believes is finished. And some tired mornings, $49 a night, alone, I'd catch myself sinking into the fog, for real, letting the vagueness I performed for Marcus start to feel like the truth, thinking, maybe I am done. Maybe I should just let them have it and go quiet into whatever's left. That, I think, is the real danger the world holds out to older people. Not just that others will underestimate you, that you'll start to accept the estimate, that you'll agree to be small because it's offered to you so insistently, so gently, so often. What pulled me back Every single time was the notebook and the camera, and one image I kept taped inside the cover of that spiral notebook where I'd see it every morning. Not a photo of the villains. A photo of Margaret, from a summer years ago, laughing on the back step, her head thrown back, gloriously, completely alive. I'd look at that picture and I'd remember that she had not spent her last strength climbing a lawyer's stairs to leave me a will and a letter and a watchful neighbor so that I could sink into a motel bed and agree to disappear. She'd built me 3 locks against exactly this. The least I could do was be the man she built them for. So I'd close the notebook and drink the terrible coffee and go back to work, and the fog would lift because I chose to lift it. That's the thing the young ones truly don't understand about the old lion. His stillness isn't surrender. It's the hardest kind of discipline there is, the discipline to look completely finished, while you are, in fact, the most awake and dangerous thing in the whole enclosure. There was a rhythm to those weeks that I almost, God forgive me, came to enjoy by the end. Every phone call from Marcus was a small performance and a small victory. He'd call to check that I was still contained, still fading, still no threat, and I'd give him a little more of the fog he wanted, and I'd hang up and add another recording to the file. He thought each call reassured him. Each one buried him deeper. Vanessa, I noticed on the cameras, stopped worrying about me entirely around week 4. She stopped even mentioning me. In her mind, I was already filed away, a problem solved, an old man safely stored. And that, precisely that, was what I'd been working toward. Because the most dangerous moment for any predator is the moment they stop watching the thing they think they've killed. Vanessa stopped watching me in week 4. I never once stopped watching her. That asymmetry, that single quiet advantage, was the whole game, and she handed it to me by being exactly as arrogant as I'd counted on her being. Let me tell you about the day I nearly broke the promise to Margaret, because I want to be honest with you, and because the old lion is not made of stone. He feels it. He just doesn't waste it. It was about 3 weeks into the watching. I opened the feed one morning, and Vanessa was in the living room with a man I'd never seen, and I understood at once that this was Wes. He was younger than her, hard-faced, wearing the kind of clothes a man wears when he wants to look like he isn't paying attention, and the two of them were going through Margaret's things. Really going through them now. Not appraising, taking. And Wes picked up the last thing in the world I could stand to see him touch. Margaret's wedding ring. I kept it, in a small dish on the mantel, because I could not bear to put it away. Wes picked it up, held it to the light, and I watched him say, and I could read his lips, "What's this worth?" And Vanessa, my son's wife, standing in my wife's living room, shrugged and said something, and dropped my Margaret's wedding ring into a plastic bag with a fistful of other gold. I stood up so fast I knocked the motel chair over. I had my car keys in my hand. I was going to drive to that house, and I was going to go through the mudroom door, and I was going to end it with these 2 hands, right there, promise or no promise. I got as far as the parking lot. I was shaking, the bad shaking, the kind that isn't age. And I stopped, standing on the cracked asphalt of the Cypress Rest, because a thought arrived with the force of a slap. If I go over there now, I lose. Everything Margaret built for me, everything she saw coming and prepared for. I throw it all away in one hot minute, and Vanessa walks, and the deed maybe even stands, and I become exactly the unstable old man they've been describing. The ring is not worth the war. And then, right behind that thought, came a colder and better one. That ring is not gone. That ring is evidence. It is on camera, in her hand, going into a bag. She has just handed me theft, plain theft, on top of everything else. And she doesn't even know it. She thinks she's taking something from me. She's giving me another tumbler. I went back inside. I picked up the chair. I sat down, and I watched, and I recorded, and I let them take the ring, because I knew, the way you know the sun will come up, that I was going to get it back, and a great deal more besides. The old lion watched them take a bite. He did not move. He was counting. That was the night Elena Cruz called Frank, with what she'd found about the Hollisters, and the whole thing got bigger and darker than I had let myself imagine. The Hollisters were a couple in the next county over. 2 years back, an elderly man named Raymond Hollister, a widower, had voluntarily transferred his home and liquidated his savings into an account managed by a family financial advisor, and had then been moved into assisted living, where he died 14 months later. The advisor's name on none of the paperwork, of course. But Elena, doing the patient work, found a notary. A notary who had stamped the Hollister transfer. And the same notary, it turned out, had stamped my forged deed. A woman named Doreen Pruitt, who ran a little sign and notary shop in a strip mall, and who, Elena discovered, had lost her license once already for stamping documents without the signer present. Doreen Pruitt was the crack in the whole wall. Because a scheme needs a notary, and a bad notary who reuses herself is a thread you can pull until the entire sweater comes apart in your hands. And there was one more thing, Wes. Elena ran the man Vanessa called Wes, based on a photograph I pulled off my own camera feed, and matched him to a Wesley Corbin, who had a record for financial exploitation of vulnerable adults in 2 states, and who was, according to a marriage record Elena dug up, not Vanessa's associate at all. He was her husband. Let me say that again, because it took me a full minute to absorb it, sitting in that motel with the phone against my ear. The woman married to my son, the woman I had let call me Dad, the woman crying at my Margaret's funeral in a black dress, was already married to Wesley Corbin, a career elder fraud predator, which meant her marriage to Marcus was a bigamous fraud, which meant my son was not the mastermind of this thing at all. My son was one of the marks. I sat with that for a long, strange time, because it changed everything, and it changed nothing. Marcus had still stood on that porch. He had still packed my life into a fishing bag. He had still called Margaret's wife a confused old man and closed his own father's door in his face. He had done real harm, and he would answer for it. But he had also, I now understood, been played by 2 professionals who had seen in my clever, weak, greedy boy the perfect instrument, a real son with a real claim, who could hand them a house and take the blame if it ever came apart. They had married my son to get to my life, and when they were done, they would have discarded him as easily as they'd discarded the Hollisters, as easily as they'd tried to discard me. I am not going to pretend I forgave Marcus in that motel room. I didn't. That came much later, and only partway. But something in my chest shifted. Some old fatherly thing I thought had died on that porch. My boy was a fool and a coward, and he had wronged me badly. And he was also about to be the last loose end that 2 dangerous people needed to tie off. Whatever I built now, I realized, I had to build so that it fell on the ones who deserved it most, and only glanced the fool who deserved it least. The old lion, it turns out, still knows his own cub, even a bad one, even one who forgot him. Before I set that trap, though, I owe you the rest of what Elena Cruz found, because it turned my private grievance into something larger than me, and it's the reason I stopped thinking of this as revenge and started thinking of it as a debt I owed to strangers. Elena Cruz is not what you picture when you hear private investigator. She's a small, unhurried woman in her 50s who used to work fraud for an insurance company. And she does most of her work sitting at a desk with public records and a legal pad, not skulking around in cars. The movies got it wrong, she told me the first time we met, in Frank's conference room, spreading documents across the table like a card dealer. Nobody hides money as well as they think. They hide it from a person glancing. They can't hide it from a person reading. And I read. She tapped a stack of paper. These two have been reading you for 2 years, Mr. Reyes. Now somebody's finally reading them back. What she read, over those weeks, was a map of everything Vanessa and Wesley Corbin had done, and it went back much further than my family. The pattern was always the same, and once Elena laid it out, I could not unsee it. Find an aging widow or widower, with a paid-off home and some savings, and crucially, an adult child who was struggling, greedy, or estranged. Move in through that child, marry them if necessary. And Vanessa had married 3 times that Elena could document, never once bothering to divorce. Use the child to gain access and legitimacy. Forge the transfers with the help of a bent notary. Drain the accounts, sell the valuables, and move the elderly parent into a facility where they'd be out of sight while the paperwork settled. And when it was done, dissolve the marriage, discard the child, and move 2 states over to do it again under a new name. They were not thieves. They were farmers. They planted themselves in families and harvested them. Raymond Hollister was their previous harvest. And it was through his daughter that this whole thing stopped being about my house and started being about something I could actually be proud of. Elena found Paige Hollister living in the next county. And she was, when Elena first approached her, a woman eaten alive by guilt, because Paige had been the estranged child in her family's version of the story. She and her father hadn't spoken in years when the Corbins found them, and they'd used that estrangement as the wedge, telling old Raymond that his daughter didn't care about him, telling Paige that her father wanted nothing to do with her, keeping them apart while they stripped him clean. By the time Paige learned her father had given away his house and been moved into assisted living, he was already sick, and the accounts were already empty, and she had convinced herself it was somehow her fault for not being there. He died 14 months later believing, because they'd made sure of it, that his own daughter had abandoned him. I drove out to meet Paige Hollister myself, once Elena had made the introduction, because I felt I owed her a face and not just a phone call. We sat in her kitchen, and I told her my story, and she told me hers, and somewhere in the middle of it, this composed, middle-aged woman put her head down on her own kitchen table and wept, the way you weep for something you can never fix. And I did for her the only thing I could do, which was to tell her the truth that Elena had uncovered, that her father had not been abandoned, that he had been targeted, professionally, by people who manufactured the distance between them and profited from it, that the last painful year of his life had been engineered by strangers for money. It was a terrible truth, but it was a cleaner one than the lie she'd been carrying, and I watched it land, and I watched something in her shoulders come down that had been up for 2 years. They didn't just steal his money, she said finally, wiping her face. They stole the end of my father's life. They made him die thinking I didn't love him. And I said, I know. And that's exactly why we're not going to let them do it quietly. She looked at me a long moment, and then this woman who had been drowning in guilt reached across her kitchen table and shook my hand like we were signing a treaty, and in a way, we were. Paige Hollister had kept everything. That's the thing about a guilty person. They hoard the evidence of their own supposed failure, and she had boxes of it. Her father's letters, the facility paperwork, the strange documents she'd been sent after his death and never understood. And in one of those boxes was a notarized transfer with a familiar smudged stamp on it. Doreen Pruitt, the same notary who had stamped my forged deed. 2 families, 2 counties, 2 years apart, 1 crooked stamp, connecting them like a fingerprint, left at 2 different burglaries. That single document was the thing that turned my pile of camera footage from a family dispute into a criminal pattern. Because a pattern is what makes a prosecutor lean forward. 1 victim is a sad story. 2 victims with the same notary is a conspiracy. Elena kept pulling threads. She found the marriage records that proved the bigamy. She found Wesley Corbin's prior convictions in 2 states, under 2 spellings of his name. She found the quick haul receipts that Ruth Kaminsky's notebook had pointed us to, itemizing my wife's furniture down to the maple dining set Margaret's mother had left her. And she found the account, a business account under a shell company, with an address that turned out to be a mailbox in a strip mall, into which $340,000 of my life had been funneled in a series of transfers, small enough to avoid the reports banks are required to file. Structured, Elena called it. They structured it, she said. Which is its own separate federal crime, by the way. These people don't commit 1 crime. They commit a nest of them, and each one is a thread. And I have spent my whole career learning that if you pull enough threads at once, there's nothing left to hold the sweater together. By the end, Elena Cruz had assembled a binder 4 inches thick. Every page of it patient, sourced, dated, unglamorous, and absolutely lethal. She slid it across the table to Frank one afternoon and said, "That's not a case. That's a conviction that hasn't happened yet." And Frank, who does not hand out praise, looked through it slowly and then looked at Elena over his glasses and said, "In 40 years, this is the cleanest package anyone's ever put in front of me." It was the binder, along with my camera footage and my wife's will and letter, that Elena and Frank took to Detective Sandra Okafor of the County Financial Crimes Unit. And Detective Okafor, who had seen 100 cases like the Hollisters die for lack of exactly this kind of documentation, opened a file the same week and, quietly, began to build the room I would eventually walk my son and his wife into. That is what patience buys you, not just your own house back. It buys you the chance to be the wall that a professional predator finally breaks against, so that the next family down the line never has to. Raymond Hollister could not be saved, but somewhere out there was a next intended victim, some grieving widow with a struggling son, and because an old locksmith decided not to roar on his own porch, that person would get to keep their home and their savings, and the truth about their own family. I didn't know their name. I never will. But I built the whole slow thing for them as much as for me. And Margaret, I am certain, would have called that the only kind of revenge worth the name. I called Frank the next morning, and I told him it was time to stop only watching and start setting the trap. We had the will. We had the doctors. We had the letter. We had weeks of camera footage. We had the notary, the Hollisters, and Wesley Corbin's record. What we did not yet have, Frank said, was the one thing that would make a jury stop wondering and start nodding. We have a scheme, Frank said. What we don't have, yet, is the 2 of them saying it out loud, in their own words, knowing what they did and why. Give me that, Nathaniel, and there is no lawyer alive who can save them. He paused. Can your camera give me that? I looked at the little laptop, at the grainy live feed of my own living room, where my wife's reading chair sat empty, and a fake smoke detector kept its patient watch. Frank, I said, I think I can do better than that. I think I can make them say it. All I have to do is give them a reason to talk, and I know exactly what reason to give them. Because I had realized something, watching them all these weeks. Thieves are only calm when they think the job is finished. The way to make a thief say everything is to make them believe the job is coming apart. And I knew exactly how to walk into that house and make my son and his wife believe, for the first time, that they were about to lose everything. I just had to do it, as the confused old man they still believed I was. Frank hated the plan. I want to be fair to him. He hated it thoroughly, and he told me so for 20 minutes. "You're a witness and a victim, not an operative," he said, his voice tight with the frustration of a careful man watching a stubborn one. "You walk in there and say the wrong thing, and you hand their defense attorney a gift." But I had thought it through, the way I thought through a job, and I laid it out for him one pin at a time, and by the end, he was quiet. And then he said the thing lawyers say, when they've decided to let you do the thing they told you not to. "If you do this, you do it my way. You wear nothing, carry nothing, record nothing on your person. Because I don't want a wire complicating the camera evidence you already own. You go in as a confused old man, asking a confused old question. You say your lines and you leave. You do not accuse. You do not threaten. You light the match and you walk away, and you let the room catch fire on its own. Can you do that?" I could do that. I had been doing exactly that on the phone for weeks. The old lion does not chase the herd. He gives them a reason to run in the direction he's already chosen. Here was the match I chose. I would call Marcus, in my small, foggy voice, and I would tell him I'd gotten a letter from some lawyer about Mom's real papers, and that I was confused, and that a nice man named Frank had left a message about a will, and I didn't understand it, and could I please come by the house to talk about it, because I didn't know what to do. Every word of it true, technically, which was the beauty of it. And then I would show up, and I would sit in my own living room, directly in front of the fake smoke detector, and I would let them panic. Because the one thing that would break their calm was the thing they feared most and did not know had already happened. That Margaret had left a real will. That the deed they forged had a natural enemy sitting in a lawyer's vault. If they believed that will existed, they would have to talk about the forgery to figure out how much danger they were in. And they would have to do it fast, and in private, in a room I owned a camera in. I made the call on a Tuesday evening. My son answered on the third ring, wary, and I gave him the performance of my life. I let my voice wander. I repeated myself. I said, "Your mother," and let it crack. And I said the magic words. Some lawyer says, "Mom left a will, a real one, and I don't understand. Marcus, I signed the house to you, didn't I? Didn't I sign it? Now there's a will, and I'm all mixed up." There was a silence on the line, so total I could hear my own heartbeat. Then Marcus said, in a voice trying very hard to be gentle, Dad, come by tomorrow. Come by around 1. We'll straighten it all out. Don't call any lawyers back, okay? They prey on people like you. Just come see us. Come see us." He thought he was reeling me in. I hung up the phone and I looked at Frank and I said, 1 o'clock tomorrow. Frank exhaled slowly and said, "God help us. Turn the camera to record the second you hang up with me tonight, and don't stop it for anything." I did not sleep much, not from fear, from the strange, electric stillness that I imagined that old lion felt in the last hour before he finally rose. I lay in the dark and I talked to Margaret, out loud, in a $49 room, and I told her I'd found her letter, and I told her I was going to do it her way, the old lion's way, and I told her I loved her, and somewhere near 3 in the morning, I finally slept. At 1 o'clock the next afternoon, I knocked on my own front door. Vanessa opened it, and the transformation on her face was a thing to behold. The instant reassembly from whatever she'd been into loving, worried, dad-adoring Vanessa. "Oh, Dad," she breathed, all honey, taking my arm as if I might tip over. Come in. You look tired." I let her lead me. I let myself shuffle. I let my eyes go loose and wandering, and I let them settle, just for a moment, on the mantel where Margaret's ring dish sat empty, and I let my face crumple a little, real grief in service of a fake weakness, and I saw Vanessa clock it and dismiss it. Good. Underestimate me. Please. They sat me in Margaret's reading chair, directly under the bookshelf, directly in front of the fake smoke detector, which was, I knew, recording every second in color to a drive in the attic and a cloud they couldn't reach. Marcus sat across from me, and Vanessa perched on the arm of the sofa, and I began, in my small mixed-up voice, to light the match. There was a letter, I said, from a Mr. Delgado. He says your mother left a will, a real one. He says it's in his safe. I looked between them, wet-eyed and vague. But I signed the house to you, didn't I, son? So how can there be a will? I'm all turned around. Can a will undo the thing I signed? And I watched it land. I watched Vanessa's face do a thing that faces do when the floor moves. Marcus said quickly, too quickly, "Dad, there's no will, okay? Mom didn't leave a will. This Delgado guy is a scammer. Give me his number. I'll deal with him." I said, "But he had the papers, Marcus." He described them, and I let a silence sit. Then I did the only bold thing the plan allowed. I said I needed to use the bathroom, and I got up, slow and shaky, and I shuffled down the hall, and I stayed in that bathroom for a long, long time, running the tap, being a slow old man, because I absolutely knew, that the moment they thought I was out of earshot, these two would turn to each other and start doing math, and every word of that math would go into the drive in the attic. I stood in my own bathroom, the tap running, and I did not need to hear them to know it was happening. But later, when Frank and I sat in his office and watched the footage, we heard all of it. And I am going to tell it to you exactly as it played, because this is the confession, this is the tumbler that closed the whole lock, and my son and his wife handed it to us for free. The second the bathroom door shut, Vanessa's honey was gone. Her voice came out flat and fast and furious. "A will. You told me there was no will. You told me the old man's paperwork was all in that box, and you cleaned out the box." Marcus, defensive, whining. "There wasn't a will. I looked. I took everything out of the fireproof box. I gave it all to you and Wes. And there it was, on my camera, my son's voice saying Wes, tying himself to the man he thought was a stranger." Vanessa hissed, "Do not say his name in this house." Marcus, louder. "Drink already in him at 1 in the afternoon. Why not? He's your husband, isn't he? You think I'm stupid? I know what this was. I know what I signed those forms for. Just tell me the old man can't undo it. Tell me the deed holds." And Vanessa said the sentence that ended her. She said, cold and precise, every consonant a nail. "The deed holds, because Doreen stamped it, and your father was too busy blubbering at the cemetery to notice you'd cleaned out his accounts. $340,000, Marcus. It's already moved. It's already gone. The house is just the cherry. So no, some ambulance-chasing lawyer with a piece of paper is not going to unwind $340,000 unless you keep saying that man's name and screaming until the neighbors call somebody. Now put your drink down and go check on your father before he wanders off and remembers his own phone number. $340,000. Already moved. Already gone. The house is just the cherry. My son's wife, in my wife's living room, saying it out loud, to a camera she didn't know existed, in words no jury on earth could misunderstand. I flushed the toilet. I ran the tap one more time. I fixed my face back into fog, and I shuffled out into the hall and let my son walk me back to Margaret's chair with his hand under my elbow and I looked up at him, this boy I'd taught to ride a bike, and I said, in my small lost voice, "Everything's going to be okay, isn't it, son?" And Marcus, God help him. Marcus looked at me with something I hadn't seen on his face in years, something that might even have been shame, and he said, "Yeah, Dad, it's all going to be okay." And in that moment, I almost pitied him, almost. Then I remembered the fishing bag on the porch, and the pity went where it belonged, into the file. I let them believe they'd talked me down. I let Vanessa tell me, all honey again, that she'd handle the lawyer, and that I should rest, and that they'd come see me at the home on Sunday. I let them walk me to the door, the same door Marcus had closed in my face 3 weeks before, and I stepped out onto the porch, and Vanessa said, "Love you, Dad," and I said, "Love you too," and I meant, silently, every year of it. I walked to my car. I did not look back. And I drove to Frank Delgado's office, with 340,000 reasons. The old lion no longer needed to wait. Frank watched the footage twice, without speaking. When it ended the second time, he took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and said, in the flat, quiet voice of a man who has just watched a case build itself, "Nathaniel, in 40 years, I have never had a defendant hand me a confession like that. She names the notary. She names the amount. She says it's already moved. She all but names her real husband." He put his glasses back on. "And your son puts himself at the scene of the forgery, in his own words, while establishing, for us, that he was manipulated. This is not a case anymore. This is a demolition." He looked at me. "Now, do you want to do it quietly? A settlement? The money back? They disappear? Or do you want to do it in the light?" You already know what I told him. But before I tell you how we did it in the light, and it was in the light, brighter than any of us expected, let me be honest about the days in between. Because they were not triumphant. They were the hardest of the whole thing. Because now I had it. I had all of it. I had the power, finally, to bring the roof down on my son. And every night in that motel, I had to decide, again, that I was going to do it. People imagine that the moment you get the goods on someone who wronged you, it feels like victory. It doesn't. Not when one of them is your boy. I would lie awake and I would remember Marcus at 8, the summer I taught him to pick a simple lock in the garage, how his whole face lit up when the little practice padlock sprang open in his hands, how he ran to show Margaret, "Mom, Mom, I did it. Dad showed me." And then I would remember Vanessa's voice, too busy blubbering at the cemetery, and I would remember that my son had chosen with his own free will, to stand on that porch. Both things were true. That is the part nobody warns you about. Both things stay true the whole way down. I made a decision in those days that I want to tell you about, because it is the closest I came to keeping my promise to Margaret, and the closest I came to breaking it, and they turned out to be the same decision. I went to see Marcus, alone, off camera, against Frank's explicit instructions, which I seem to have made a habit of. I asked him to meet me at a diner, Neutral Ground, the old Bluebird on Route 9, where I used to take him for pancakes. I told him on the phone it was about the home and money, which got him there. And when he sat down across from me in that vinyl booth, I let the fog fall away from my face for the first time in front of him, and I watched him notice, and I watched a flicker of confusion cross his eyes, because some animal part of him registered that the old man across the table was not the one he'd been talking to on the phone. "Marcus," I said, in my own voice, my real voice, level and clear. "I'm going to say some things, and you're going to listen. I know about the deed. I know Doreen Pruitt notarized a signature I never made. I know about the $340,000. I know about Wes. I know his real name is Wesley Corbin. And I know he is Vanessa's husband. And I know what the two of them did to a man named Raymond Hollister before they did it to us. I watched the blood leave my son's face, one word at a time. And I know, I said, softer now, that you are not the smart one in this. You never were. They found you because you were exactly the tool they needed. A real son, with a real grievance, who could be pointed at his own father. He tried to talk. I raised one hand and he stopped, 43 years old, and still stopping, when his father raised a hand. I am not here to threaten you, I said. I'm here because your mother made me promise not to let this turn me hard, so I'm giving you something she would have wanted me to give you, and it's the only thing I have left to give you, and it's the truth, one time, plainly. This is going to come down, all of it, soon. You cannot stop it. But you get to choose which side of it you're standing on when it does. You can keep protecting the woman who used you, and let her take you all the way to the bottom, or you can do the one decent thing left available to you. I stood up and put a $10 bill on the table for the coffee. You have until the reading of your mother's will, I said. Frank Delgado's office, Thursday, 10 o'clock. Everyone's going to be there. Be a man there, Marcus. It's the last exit before the bridge is out. And I walked out of the Bluebird and left my son sitting alone in the booth where he used to eat pancakes, and I did not know, driving away, whether I had just saved him or warned the enemy. I had taken a real risk. He could call Vanessa. He could call Wes. They could run. Frank was going to be furious, and Frank was right to be furious. But I knew my boy. I knew the fool. And I was betting the whole thing, the whole beautiful lock I'd built, on the chance that somewhere under the coward there was still the little boy who ran to his mother, shouting, "Dad showed me." Sometimes the oldest, most dangerous move an old lion makes is to turn his back on purpose and let the young one decide, all on his own, whether he's still part of the pride. I found out on Thursday, at 10 o'clock, in a lawyer's conference room, in front of everyone, whether I'd bet right. Let me set the room for you, because Frank had set it with great care, and Frank does nothing by accident. The conference room at Delgado and Associates is long and paneled in dark wood, with a single heavy table down the middle and tall windows along one wall. Frank had arranged it as a formal reading of the will of Margaret Reyes, and he had sent formal notices, because a formal reading gives a lawyer a legitimate reason to put every interested party in one room at one time. Around that table, at 10 o'clock on a gray Thursday morning, sat the following people. Frank Delgado at the head, calm as a judge. Me, at his right hand, in my good suit, the gray one Margaret had picked out, clean-shaven, clear-eyed, not a trace of fog. Marcus, who had actually come, sitting halfway down the table, looking like a man who hadn't slept in a week. Vanessa beside him, in another expensive black dress, radiating wounded patience, having decided, I could see, to play the loyal grieving daughter-in-law right to the end. And, because Vanessa had insisted on it, and Frank had quietly allowed it, a man she'd introduced at the door as our family's financial advisor, Mr. Corbin. He handles the estate questions. Wesley Corbin, sitting at my table, in a suit, believing he was there to manage a problem. He had come. That was the thing I almost couldn't believe. Elena Cruz had suspected he would, and she'd been right. A predator that confident doesn't send his instrument in alone to a will reading that might threaten $340,000. He came to keep his hand on Vanessa, and on Marcus, and on the outcome. He walked into a lawyer's office, believing he was the smartest and most dangerous man in the building. He was not. And what he did not know, what none of the three of them knew, was who else was in the building. Because in the room next door, on the other side of a door Frank could open with one hand, sat Detective Sandra Okafor, of the county's financial crimes unit, and a second detective, and a court reporter, and a laptop already queued to a video file. Elena Cruz had spent 2 weeks taking everything I'd gathered to the right people. And the right people had opened a case. And the right people were now sitting 15 feet away, listening through a door left carefully ajar. Frank began the way he does everything, slowly and without drama. Thank you all for coming. We are here for the reading of the last will and testament of Margaret Ellen Reyes. He put on his glasses. He lifted a document, and Vanessa, who could not help herself, said, gently, so gently, Frank, before we start, I have to say, I'm worried about Dad being here for this. It's a lot. He gets confused, and I don't want him upset. She reached across and patted my hand. We love you, Dad. We just want to protect you. And I looked at her, and I let the room see me look at her. And I said, in my own voice, clear enough to carry to the back of the room, and through the door left ajar, Vanessa, I have never been less confused in my life. Frank did not wait. Frank is a professional. He said, before I read Mrs. Reyes's will, there is a preliminary matter concerning a competing document, a deed, recorded in May of this year, purporting to transfer the residence at Cypress Lane from Nathaniel Reyes to Marcus and Vanessa Reyes. He slid a copy down the table. This deed is a forgery. Mr. Reyes never signed it. We have 2 independent physicians attesting to his full competence. We have a forensic document examiner's report on the signature, and we have the notary's own records, which we obtained lawfully, showing the stamp was applied by Doreen Pruitt, without the signer present, which is the same pattern Ms. Pruitt used on a transfer of property belonging to the late Raymond Hollister. He let the name Hollister sit in the air. I watched Wesley Corbin go very still, not panicked, still, the stillness of a professional recalculating. He was the only one of the 3 smart enough to understand, in that instant, that this was not a will reading. It was a room closing around him. Vanessa laughed, a light social laugh that didn't reach her eyes, the exact laugh Margaret had warned me about. This is insane, she said. Dad signed that deed. He's clearly been manipulated by someone, probably this lawyer, into turning on his own family. Marcus, are you going to let them do this to your father? And she turned to my son, and she put her hand on his arm, and she gave him the look, the one that had run him for 2 years. And this was the moment. This was the pin I had turned my back at the Bluebird to set. Everything I'd risked, the whole gamble, came down to what my son did in the next 5 seconds. Marcus looked at her hand on his arm. Then he looked down the table at me. And I did not nod, or plead, or signal anything. I just looked back at my boy and let him choose, the way you have to let them choose, or it doesn't count. He took her hand off his arm. He set it back on the table, carefully, like something he was returning, and he said, in a voice that shook and then steadied, her name is not Vanessa Reyes. The room went silent. Her name is Vanessa Corbin. She's married to him. He didn't look at Wesley. She's been married to him the whole time. I found out. I signed the forms because they told me it was to protect Dad's money from taxes. And then I signed more. And then it was too late. And then I was scared. And I told myself it was okay, because Dad was old and he'd never know. His voice broke completely. And then he stood on the porch, with dirt on his knees from Mom's grave, and I closed the door on him. I closed the door on my own father. He put his face in his hands. It's all true, he said, to Frank, to the room, to the door left ajar. The deed's fake. The money's gone. $340,000. They moved it. I helped them. It's all true. And I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. I have replayed that moment 1,000 times. My son, 43 years old, breaking apart at a conference table, choosing, too late, but not entirely too late, to be his mother's son. I did not feel triumph. I want to be honest with you all the way to the end. I felt grief, a father's grief, which is the oldest grief there is. But underneath it, quiet and steady, I also felt Margaret, because he had chosen. The little boy who ran shouting "Dad" showed me, was still in there, buried under 20 years of foolishness, and at the last possible moment, with the bridge going out, he'd walked back across it. Vanessa's face had changed. The honey was gone for good now, and what was underneath was flat and reptilian, and completely without warmth, and I understood I was finally seeing the real face, the one Margaret had seen across a Thanksgiving table 2 years before, and known to fear. She started to stand. "This is a setup," she said to Wesley. "We're leaving." And Wesley Corbin, career predator, the smartest man in the building, stood up smoothly and buttoned his jacket and said, "We're done here. My clients are leaving." He'd decided to bull his way out on confidence, the way men like him always have. That was when Frank Delgado leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and said the sentence, "I will treasure until the day I lie down next to Margaret." "Before you go," Frank said mildly, "I should mention that everything said in this room, in the last 10 minutes, has been heard by Detective Sandra Okafor of the County Financial Crimes Unit, who is in the next room, and who has, in addition to your statements just now, approximately 6 weeks of video recorded lawfully inside Mr. Reyes's own home, in which Mrs. Corbin describes the movement of $340,000, names the notary, and refers to the earlier matter of Mr. Hollister." Frank smiled, and it was not a warm smile. "You're welcome to leave. I'd only observe that the parking lot is also being watched." And Frank reached over and pushed open the door that had been left ajar. "I want you to picture the last thing Vanessa Corbin did before she understood it was finished, because it told me everything about who she really was." In the half-second the door swung open. Before anyone else in the room had fully moved, her eyes went not to the detectives, not to Wesley, not to me. They went to the tall windows. She was measuring them, calculating the drop, the parking lot, the distance to a car. Even then, even caught, even done, the only instinct in her was to run and reset and find the next family. There was no fear in her face, and no shame, just arithmetic. And I understood, watching her measure the windows, that people like her are not evil the way the movies teach us evil, all fire and menace. They're evil the way a cold engine is cold. There's simply nothing warm in there to appeal to. Margaret had seen that across a Thanksgiving table 2 years before any of us. "Count the silverware," she'd written. My wife counted the silverware, and she was right down to the last spoon. Detective Okafor, who I would come to respect enormously, did not raise her voice once. She didn't have to. She had the binder, and the will, and 6 weeks of footage, and now a room full of witnesses to a confession the Corbins had just repeated live. She'd been building financial crimes cases for 11 years, she told me later, and most of them fell apart for exactly the thing this one had in overflowing abundance: documentation. "Usually I have a victim's word against a family member's word," she said, "and a jury can't tell whose memory to trust, and the case dies. You didn't give me your word, Mr. Reyes. You gave me a video, a will, a letter, a notary, a second victim, and a confession. In 11 years, nobody's ever handed me a case that built itself the way yours did." I told her the truth, which was that I hadn't built it alone. My wife started it from her sickbed. A neighbor kept it alive with a notebook. A guilty daughter 2 counties over kept the last thread. And an old lawyer and a patient investigator wove it all together. I just refused to roar too early. That was my only real contribution. I refused, when every nerve in my body screamed to open the door before the lock was finished. And Frank reached over, and the door swung wide, and Detective Sandra Okafor stepped into the room. I will not dress up what happened next, because it happened fast, and it happened without any drama at all, which is how real consequences arrive. Detective Okafor came through the door with her partner and 2 uniformed officers, who had been in the lobby, and she was calm and unhurried, and she read Vanessa Corbin and Wesley Corbin their rights, in a level voice, while a 4th officer stood by the windows, in case Wesley decided to be foolish. He did not. Men like him never fight when they're finally caught. They save it for the appeal. Vanessa said nothing at all. She had gone somewhere behind her own eyes, already working the next angle, already becoming whoever she'd need to be for the next set of marks. Except there weren't going to be any next marks. Not for a long, long time. They took Wesley out first, then Vanessa. As she passed my chair, she stopped, just for a second, and she looked down at me, and she said, very quietly, so only I could hear, "You think you won something, old man." And I looked up at my dead wife's warning made flesh, and I said, just as quietly, "No, I didn't win anything. You lost. There's a difference, and at your age you should learn it. You've got time to now." And they walked her out into the gray morning, and the door of the conference room swung shut behind her, and it was, at last, over. Almost over. There was still my son. Marcus was arrested too. I want you to understand that, because it matters, and because I did not fight it, though Frank told me I could have. My son had committed real crimes. He'd signed fraudulent documents. He'd participated, knowingly at the end, in the theft of his own father's home and savings. Justice that only falls on strangers isn't justice. It's favoritism. And Margaret raised me better, and helped me raise him better than that, even if it didn't take the first time. Detective Okafor arrested Marcus as well, and he did not resist, and he did not look away from me as they did it. He looked right at me the whole time, and I looked right back, and I gave him the one thing I had left to give, which was that I did not look away either. But here is the part I asked Frank to make sure happened, and the part I'll carry as the proudest thing I did in the whole affair. Before any of it went to a prosecutor, I sat down with Frank and Detective Okafor, and I told them, on the record, everything I knew about how Vanessa and Wesley had found my son, groomed him, married him, used him, and planned to discard him. I told them about the Bluebird Diner, and the choice I gave him, and the choice he made in that conference room in front of witnesses, turning on the people who'd used him at the exact moment it cost him the most to do it. I did not ask them to let him go. I asked them to tell the truth about him, which is all any of us can really ask, in the end, that the whole truth be told, and not just the convenient part. And the truth about my son, the whole truth, was that he was a weak and foolish man who did a terrible thing to his father, and who, given one last chance to be his mother's son, took it. Now, the consequences. You've been patient, and this niche knows that the ending is a promise, so let me keep it precisely, name by name, number by number, the way I'd close out a job. Wesley Corbin, whose real history Elena Cruz and Detective Okafor unspooled all the way back, was charged in 3 counts of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, along with the forgery and money laundering. The Hollister matter reopened on the strength of the notary connection, and Raymond Hollister's surviving daughter, a woman named Paige, who I have since come to know and admire, came forward, and her father's case became part of his. Wesley Corbin was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 19 years in state prison. He will be older than I am now when he comes out, if he comes out. The old lion outweighted the young one, after all. Vanessa Corbin, who turned out to have 2 prior identities and a trail Elena traced across 4 states, was convicted of forgery, bigamy, money laundering, and financial exploitation, and was sentenced to 14 years. Doreen Pruitt, the notary, lost her license permanently and was sentenced to 3 years for her part. And I confess, I felt nothing about her either way. A small, corroded person who rented out her stamp and never once looked at the faces of the people she was helping to rob. The $340,000 was not gone after all, or not all of it. This is the part the schemers never account for. Moving money and hiding money are different skills, and Wesley was better at the first than the second. Forensic accountants working with Detective Okafor's unit traced the funds through a chain of accounts, and over the following 8 months, $291,000 was recovered and returned to me. The house, the forged deed voided by my wife's true will, was mine again, free and clear, the way she and I had built it. And my son, Marcus, pleaded guilty. He did not make anyone prove anything, did not put me on a stand, did not hide behind a lawyer's tricks. He stood up in court and said what he'd done, because he cooperated fully, because he turned on the Corbins and testified against them, because his own father stood up at his sentencing and told the judge the whole truth, including the part about the boy who ran shouting, "Dad showed me." Marcus was sentenced to 2 years, with eligibility for early release into a supervised program. The judge, a tired and decent woman about my age, looked at my son a long time before she passed sentence, and then she looked at me, and she said something I've thought about ever since. She said, "Mr. Reyes, your son is fortunate in his father. See that he learns to deserve it." And then she gave him the least the law would allow, and I understood that she had heard the old lion and had decided to let one cub live. 6 months after the sentencing, on a bright morning much like the one where all this started, I stood in my own kitchen again, in my own house, and I made Margaret's apple pie from the card in the green recipe tin, the one her letter had been hiding behind. I am not much of a baker. It came out lopsided. She would have laughed at it, and then eaten 2 pieces. I set 1 slice by her wedding photograph, which I'd taken out of a donate box in a police evidence locker, and put back on the mantel where it belonged, next to her wedding ring, which came back to me in a small plastic bag with a case number on it, and which I wear now on a chain, because I could not stand to put it away, and I no longer have to. Let me tell you what happened to the people in this story, in the 6 months after. Because a resolution isn't only sentences and dollar figures. It's what people do with the lives they have left. Ruth Kaminsky still lives across the street, and she still keeps a notebook, though these days it mostly records which of the neighborhood cats has been in her flower beds. She comes over on Sundays now. We don't talk much. We sit on the back step, over the carved initials, and watch the light go gold and low. 2 widows who love the same woman in different ways. And it is not the same as sitting there with Margaret. Nothing will ever be that. But it is not nothing either. Ruth saved my house as much as anyone. With her sharp eyes and her flat voice, and her refusal to look away when the street went wrong. I told her that once, plainly, and she told me to hush and eat my pie, which is Ruth's way of saying she knows. Paige Hollister and I stayed in touch, and that surprised us both. We are bound together now by the strangest thing 2 people can share, the same predators, and there turned out to be a real friendship under it. She testified at the trial, steady and clear, and afterward she told me that finally saying it out loud in a courtroom, that her father had been targeted and not abandoned, had given her back something she'd thought was gone for good. She started a small support group in her county for the adult children of parents who were defrauded, the ones carrying that specific guilt, and she asked me to come speak to it, and I did, and I will again. Her father Raymond never got his justice in life, but his case, reopened on the back of that smudged notary stamp, put 19 years on the man who engineered the end of his days. And Paige says her father would have liked knowing he was the thread that finally held. I think she's right. And Marcus. I have saved my son for last, because his ending is the one I'm least able to tie up in a neat bow, and I won't insult you by pretending otherwise. He served his time, most of it, and he entered the supervised program, and he has, so far, done the work. He goes to the meetings. He got a job, an honest one, driving a delivery route, up before dawn. And there is something almost funny and almost holy about my son, who chased get-rich schemes his whole life, finding a kind of peace in the plain dignity of a route that has to be run the same way every day. We are not what we were. I don't know that a father and son ever fully come back from a door closed on a porch, but we are something. He comes to the house on the first Sunday of every month, and the first time he came back, he stood in the driveway a long time before he could make himself walk to the door, and when I opened it, before he said anything else, he said, "I'm not here to be forgiven, Dad. I'm just here." And I understood that was the most honest thing he'd said to me in 20 years, and I stepped back and held the door open, and my son came into the house he'd once locked me out of, and we ate dinner, and it was awkward, and quiet, and real. That's where we are, not healed, trying. In my experience, trying, kept up long enough, is most of what healing ever actually is. The last time he came, he stopped in the garage on his way out, and I found him standing over my workbench, holding the old clear practice padlock, the one I taught him on when he was 7. He didn't hear me come in. He was just turning it over in his hands, feeling the little pins set, the way I'd shown him a lifetime ago. And he looked up and saw me, and put it down, embarrassed, and I said, "Keep it, if you want it." He looked at it for a moment. Then he shook his head and set it back on the bench, gently, and he said, "No, it belongs here, with the guy who actually knows how to use it." And he left, and I stood in the garage, holding that padlock, and I understood that my son had finally learned the one lesson I'd been trying to teach him since he was a boy. That knowing how to open a thing is not the same as having the right to. That's the whole difference between a locksmith and a thief. It only took him 43 years and a prison sentence to learn it, but he learned it, and Margaret, I have to believe, knows that he did. I did something else with the money too, and I want to tell you about it, because it's the only part of this story I'd want carved on a stone somewhere. Margaret's real will left everything, after me, to the children of Lincoln Elementary, where she taught 2nd grade for 30 years. I could not wait for after me. So I took $100,000 of the recovered money, and I started the Margaret Reyes Reading Fund, which buys books and pays for a reading specialist at the school, where my wife spent her life, teaching small children to sound out words that were too big for them. There is a plaque by the library door. It has her name on it, and one line underneath, which I chose, and which is the same line I'll close on with you now. I went to the dedication in the spring. A class of 2nd graders sang a song, badly and beautifully, the way 2nd graders do, and one small girl in the front row read a book out loud to the room, sounding out a word too big for her, getting it on the 2nd try, and I had to step outside for a minute, because that was Margaret's whole life, right there. Small people, sounding out words too big for them, getting there on the 2nd try. She spent 30 years teaching children that the hard thing is doable if you're patient and you don't quit. And then she spent her last strength teaching the same lesson to a grieving old locksmith who thought he'd lost everything. 2nd try, don't quit, sounded out slow. Because people keep asking me, when they hear this story, what the lesson is, and I've turned it over, and I think it's this. My son changed the locks on the house I built, while I stood at my wife's grave, and he thought that was the end of me. He thought a locked door was a strong thing, but a lock is only ever as strong as the trust it's built on. And the moment you turn one against the person who taught you what a door is for, you haven't shut anybody out. You've shut yourself in, alone, with the kind of person who'd do that. They changed the locks on an old locksmith. They forgot that I spent my whole life knowing the one thing they never learned. Every lock has a key, and the patient man who built the house always knows where his is. So if you've ever been underestimated by the people closest to you, if you've ever been treated as weak because you were kind, or old, or quiet, or grieving, I want you to hear the old lion tell you this. Your stillness is not your weakness. Do not roar. Do not chase. Gather your proof. Keep your promise to the ones who loved you. And when the moment finally comes, and it will, open the door so cleanly that there is nothing left for anyone to argue about. They changed the locks. They just never once wondered why the old man wasn't worried. That was the last thing Margaret taught me, from behind a recipe card. And it's the thing I'll leave with you. If this story reached you, if it reminded you of your own life, or someone you love, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from, because I read every one. Like this video so it finds the next person who needs it, and subscribe to Old Lion Stories, where we tell you, every single time, that quiet is not the same thing as weak. I'll see you in the next one. Keep your keys close, and your promises closer.